The rain came down so hard that Alina could barely see the road in front of her. Her shoes were soaked through, her shawl clung to her shoulders, and her heart pounded from more than just the run. Behind her, in the warm glow of the townhouse windows, she could still hear her aunt's voice, sharp and cold, cutting through the storm like a blade. "She is a burden, Margaret. A grown woman with no husband, no fortune, and no purpose. I will not keep feeding a mouth that brings nothing back to this family." Those words had chased Alina out into the night. She had not meant to hear them. She had only gone to fetch a shawl from the hallway when she heard her aunt speaking to a visiting cousin in the parlor, discussing her future as though she were a piece of furniture to be sold off or given away. For 3 years, Alina Whitmore had lived in her aunt's grand house, first as a grieving girl who had lost her parents to fever, and then slowly, quietly, as something less than family. She poured tea. She mended dresses. She sat in corners at parties, smiling politely while no one looked her way. She had told herself again and again that it did not matter, that she did not need to be noticed, that being useful was enough. But hearing her own aunt call her a burden, hearing the plan to send her away to some distant relation in the countryside where she would be even more forgotten, something inside her finally cracked. She ran. She did not know where she was running to. She only knew she could not stand in that house one more moment and pretend she had not heard. The street was empty except for the rain and the distant rattle of a carriage somewhere in the dark. Alina pressed herself against the wall of a shuttered shop, trying to catch her breath, trying to stop the tears that mixed with the rain on her face. She thought of her parents, gone 5 years now, and how different her life might have been if they had lived. She thought of the years she had spent making herself small, making herself quiet, so that no one would have a reason to send her away. And still, it had not been enough. A carriage rounded the corner too fast, its wheels throwing up water from the flooded street. Alina barely had time to step back before it rushed past, so close that the spray soaked what little of her dress had remained dry. She caught only a glimpse of the crest painted on its door before it vanished into the night, a golden hawk on a field of deep blue. She recognized it at once. It belonged to the Duke of Ashworth, the most talked-about man in the county, a man she had glimpsed only once before, from a great distance, at a ball she had barely been allowed to attend. She did not think much of it then. She simply pulled her shawl tighter and kept walking, with nowhere in particular to go, only the need to keep moving so the cold would not catch up to her thoughts. What Alina did not know, what she could not have known, was that inside that same carriage sat the Duke himself, and that he had seen her standing against that shop wall in the rain, drenched and shaking, for just a moment before his driver rushed them past. He had told his driver to stop. The carriage had halted a short distance ahead, but by the time Julian Ashworth stepped down into the storm, the young woman was gone, swallowed by the dark streets and the rain. He stood there for a moment, rain falling on his coat, wondering why the sight of her had struck him so deeply. He told himself it was only concern for a stranger caught in the storm, but something about the way she had stood there, alone, unguarded, without the careful mask that every woman in his social circle wore, had stayed with him. It was not the first time he had noticed her. 3 weeks earlier, at the Ashworth summer ball, Julian had stood at the edge of the grand hall, enduring the usual parade of eligible young women paraded before him by their eager mothers. He had grown tired of the performance long ago, the practiced laughter, the calculated glances, the way every conversation seemed to circle back to his title and his fortune. He had learned to distrust warmth that arrived too quickly, kindness that seemed to know exactly how much attention he required. It was during a lull in the music, when he had stepped out onto the terrace to escape the crowd, that he first saw her. She was not dancing. She was not surrounded by admirers. She was kneeling on the stone steps beside an elderly servant who had stumbled while carrying a tray, helping the old man gather the scattered cups before anyone else even noticed he had fallen. She spoke to him gently, checked that he was not hurt, and helped him to his feet before quietly slipping back into the shadows near the wall, as if she had done nothing worth mentioning at all. Julian had asked his sister quietly who the young woman was. "That is Miss Whitmore," his sister had said, barely glancing up from her fan. "Companion to Lady Margaret. No fortune, no family name to speak of any more. Rather plain, don't you think? I am surprised she was even invited." Plain. That was the word society had chosen for her. But Julian had watched her for the rest of the evening, and he had not found her plain at all. He had found her remarkable in a way he could not quite explain, not because of anything she said or did to draw attention, but precisely because she did not try to draw attention at all. In a room full of people performing kindness for an audience, she had shown kindness to a man who could do nothing for her in return, and she had shown it as though it were simply the natural thing to do. From that night, Julian found himself watching for her. He told himself it was only curiosity, the mild interest of a man bored with the sameness of his world. But curiosity did not explain why he began attending events he would normally have avoided, simply because he knew Lady Margaret's household would be present. It did not explain why he noticed, one afternoon in the market square, that Alina gave the last of her bread to a group of children waiting outside a bakery, going hungry herself rather than let them go without. It did not explain why he found himself asking his staff, carefully and without revealing his true interest, about the quiet young woman who lived in his neighbor's house and who seemed to appear at the edges of every gathering, never at the center. He had not intended to follow her that night in the rain. His carriage had simply been passing through that part of the city on the way home from a meeting with his estate manager. But when he saw her standing there, soaked and trembling, something in him had wanted to stop, to offer her shelter, to ask if she needed help. By the time he acted on that instinct, she was already gone. Julian returned to his own grand house that night with a strange restlessness settling over him, one he could not name. He stood at the window of his study for a long while, looking out at the rain streaking down the glass, thinking of a woman who did not know he existed beyond a passing glance, a woman who believed herself invisible to the world, when in truth, she had become the one person he found himself unable to stop watching. Alina, meanwhile, had found her way to the small chapel at the edge of the square, the only building with its doors left open at that hour. She slipped inside, grateful for the shelter, and sat in the last pew, letting the silence settle around her. The candles at the front flickered gently, and for a long while she simply sat there, trying to decide what to do next. She had nowhere else to go. She had no money of her own, no family who would take her in without treating her as a burden, no plan beyond the desperate need to escape the house that no longer felt like home. She thought of her mother, who used to tell her that her worth was never measured by what others thought of her. She thought of her father, who had called her his brightest light even when the world around them grew dark with illness and debt. She wondered, sitting alone in that quiet chapel, whether either of them would recognize the woman she had become, someone who had learned to shrink herself down to nothing in order to survive. An older woman, the chapel's caretaker, found her there near midnight and gently offered her a blanket and a place to rest until morning. Alina accepted with quiet gratitude, too tired and too heartsick to argue. As she settled onto the small cot in the chapel's back room, she made herself a quiet promise. She would return to her aunt's house in the morning, not because she wanted to, but because she had nowhere else to turn, not yet. But she would not let herself disappear so easily again. She did not yet know how she would change her circumstances, only that something inside her had shifted that night, a small but stubborn spark of resolve. She could not have known that across the city, in a grand house she had only ever seen from a distance, a man who held more power and privilege than she could imagine had spent that same night unable to sleep, his thoughts circling back again and again to a woman in the rain who believed, with her whole heart, that she did not matter to anyone at all. He intended to find out who she truly was, and more than that, he intended to make certain she would never again believe herself invisible. Morning came gray and quiet, and Alina returned to her aunt's house before the household had fully woken. She slipped in through the servants' entrance, changed out of her damp clothes, and resumed her duties as though nothing had happened, as though she had not spent the night on a chapel cot with nothing but a borrowed blanket between her and the cold stone floor. Lady Margaret never asked where she had gone. She likely never noticed she had been missing at all. 3 days passed in the same quiet rhythm. Alina poured tea, mended linens, read aloud to her aunt in the evenings when her eyes grew tired, and kept her thoughts locked carefully away where no one could see them. She did not speak of what she had overheard. She did not ask her aunt about being sent away. She simply waited, watching for signs of what her future might hold, bracing herself the way she had learned to brace herself for every disappointment that had come before. It was on the 4th day that a note arrived at the house, addressed not to Lady Margaret but to Alina herself. This alone was unusual enough to draw attention from the entire household. Letters rarely came for the companion. The seal on the envelope, a golden hawk pressed into blue wax, made the housemaid who delivered it pause and stare before handing it over with wide eyes. Alina broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside, the handwriting was neat and formal, though the words themselves were simple. The Duke of Ashworth requests the return of a book left behind by a Miss Whitmore during her visit to the Ashworth Library. The book may be collected at your convenience or delivered to you upon request. Alina read the note 3 times before she understood what confused her most about it. She had never visited the Ashworth Library. She had never left a book there. She had never, in fact, set foot inside the Ashworth estate at all, apart from standing briefly on its terrace during the summer ball weeks before. She showed the note to her aunt, half expecting to be scolded for some imagined mistake. Instead, Lady Margaret's eyebrows rose with unmistakable interest. "The Duke himself sent this?" she asked, turning the paper over as though searching for some hidden meaning. "How curious! Well, you must go and collect it, of course. One does not ignore an invitation from a duke, mistaken book or not." And so, 2 days later, Alina found herself standing at the grand entrance of Ashworth Hall, her heart hammering against her ribs, dressed in her best but still plain gown, feeling entirely out of place among the marble floors and towering columns. A footman led her through corridors lined with paintings of stern ancestors, and into a library larger than any room she had ever stood inside, shelves rising 2 stories high, filled with more books than she imagined existed in the whole county. The Duke was waiting for her there, standing near a tall window with his hands clasped behind his back. He turned when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Alina curtsied, unsure of what else to do, and Julian offered a small, formal bow in return. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "thank you for coming." "Your Grace," she replied carefully, "I believe there has been some mistake. I have never visited your library before. I have not left any book here." Something flickered across his face, something close to embarrassment, though he covered it quickly. "You are right. There was no book. I am afraid I invented a reason to see you, since I could think of no honest one that would not seem improper." Alina stared at him, caught entirely off guard. No one had ever spoken to her so plainly, so directly, without pretense or performance. She did not know whether to be offended or simply astonished. "Forgive me," Julian continued, gesturing toward 2 chairs near the window. "I do not often find myself at a loss for how to begin a conversation, but with you, it seems I have failed rather badly already. Will you sit? I promise I mean no harm by this, only to speak with you if you will allow it." Alina hesitated, every instinct telling her this was strange, perhaps even improper, and yet something in his tone, steady and sincere, made her curious enough to stay. She sat, folding her hands carefully in her lap, waiting. "I saw you at the summer ball," Julian said, "on the terrace, helping an old servant who had fallen. I do not think you noticed anyone was watching." Alina's cheeks warmed. It was nothing, he needed help, anyone would have done the same. "That is precisely what struck me," Julian said, "because no one else did. There were perhaps 30 people within sight of that terrace, and every one of them looked away rather than risk soiling their gloves or drawing attention to something unpleasant. You did not hesitate. Alina did not know how to respond to that. She had grown so used to being unseen that the idea of someone having watched her, having remembered something so small, felt almost unbearable. "I did not do it to be noticed," she said quietly. "I know," Julian said. "That is why I noticed." They spoke for nearly an hour that afternoon, though Alina would later struggle to remember exactly what they had discussed. She remembered laughing, genuinely, for the first time in longer than she could recall, when Julian confessed that he had once fallen asleep during a particularly tedious sermon and woken himself with his own snoring in front of half the county. She remembered telling him, without meaning to, about her parents, about the fever that had taken them both within the same terrible week, about the strange guilt she still carried for having survived when they had not. Julian listened without offering hollow comfort or rushing to change the subject, the way most people did when grief entered a conversation uninvited. He simply listened, and something about the quality of his attention made Alina feel, for the first time in years, that her words mattered to someone. When the visit finally ended and Alina rose to leave, Julian walked her to the door himself, waving away the footman who moved to escort her. At the threshold, he paused. "May I ask you something, Miss Whitmore?" "Of course, Your Grace." "Do you truly believe you do not matter?" The question struck her like a blow, precise and unexpected. She opened her mouth to give the polite answer, the practiced denial, but something in his steady gaze made the lie stick in her throat. "I have learned not to expect otherwise," she said finally. "It is easier that way." Julian's expression grew serious. "I do not think that is a rule anyone should have to live by, least of all you." She left Ashworth Hall that day with her mind spinning, unable to make sense of the encounter, unable to decide whether it had been a kindness or simply a curiosity on the part of a bored and powerful man. She told herself firmly, all the way home, that it meant nothing, that men of his standing did not concern themselves with women like her beyond a passing moment of interest that would fade as quickly as it had appeared. But the note that arrived the following week, this time inviting her to walk in the Ashworth Gardens under the pretense of discussing a charitable donation her aunt might make, told a different story. And the note after that, and the one after that, each with a different small reason, a different careful excuse, until even Alina could no longer pretend she did not understand what was happening. Word began to travel, as it always did in a house full of servants and a society hungry for gossip. Lady Margaret, who had barely spared Alina a kind word in years, suddenly began speaking of her with new interest, correcting her posture at the dinner table, insisting she wear the good blue dress rather than her usual gray, reminding her constantly that a duke's attention, however strange its origins, was not something to be squandered through carelessness. Alina found the sudden shift in her aunt's treatment almost harder to bear than the years of neglect that came before it. She understood, with a bitterness she tried to hide, that she had not become more valuable in her aunt's eyes. Only her usefulness had changed. Still, despite her caution, despite every warning voice in her mind telling her not to hope for too much, Alina found herself waiting for each new note with an eagerness she could not fully suppress. She found herself thinking of Julian's question, again and again, turning it over in quiet moments. "Do you truly believe you do not matter?" No one had ever asked her that before. No one had ever seemed to care enough about the answer to ask. On their third meeting, walking slowly through the Ashworth Rose Gardens while a chaperone trailed at a respectful distance, Julian told her something that would stay with her far longer than either of them realized at the time. "I have watched a great many people try to earn my attention, Miss Whitmore," he said, pausing beside a bed of deep red roses. "They compliment my house, my title, my fortune. They laugh at jokes that are not funny and agree with opinions they do not truly hold. You have done none of these things. You have argued with me twice already this week." I apologize if I have been too forward, Elinor said quickly, though she did not entirely mean it. Do not apologize, Julian said, and there was something warm in his voice that made her chest ache in a way she did not understand. It is the most honest conversation I have had in years. She did not know, as she walked beside him through the fragrant garden, that Julian had begun keeping a small record in his private study, a simple list of moments he had witnessed her show kindness to those who could offer her nothing in return, moments stretching back further than she could have imagined, long before that first note had ever been sent. She did not know how deeply, how carefully, she had already been seen. The invitation to the private dinner arrived on a Tuesday, written in Julian's now familiar hand, though this time there was no false excuse attached to it, no missing book or charitable discussion to hide behind. The note simply asked Elinor to join him for supper at Ashworth Hall, with her aunt as chaperone, so that they might speak plainly about matters he described only as important. Lady Margaret spent the better part of 2 days preparing Elinor for the evening, as though she herself had somehow become responsible for what might happen there. She sent for a seamstress to alter one of her own old gowns into something that fit Elinor properly, a deep green silk that Elinor had never been permitted to wear before. She fussed over her hair, her posture, her manner of speaking, until Elinor felt less like herself and more like a doll being arranged for display. Do try not to say anything too clever, Lady Margaret warned as their carriage rolled toward the grand estate. Men like the Duke do not wish to be challenged by a companion with no fortune to her name. Elinor said nothing, though privately she thought that if Julian truly wanted a woman who agreed with everything and said nothing of substance, he could have chosen from 100 women eager to fill that role. She had seen enough of him now to suspect that was not what he wanted at all, though she still could not fully believe what he did seem to want. Dinner was a quiet, careful affair, with Lady Margaret seated close enough to observe every word exchanged, though Julian had arranged the table in such a way that conversation flowed mostly between himself and Elinor, with her aunt reduced to an attentive but largely silent presence. After the meal was cleared, Julian rose and asked if Elinor would walk with him to the small sitting room adjoining the library, where a fire had already been lit against the evening chill. Lady Margaret, given little choice but to appear gracious, allowed it, following a few steps behind and settling into a chair near the door where she could see them both without hearing every word. It was there, in the warm firelight, that Julian finally told her the truth he had been circling for weeks. I have not been entirely honest with you, Elinor, he began, and the use of her given name, without title, startled her enough that she looked up sharply. May I call you that? I find I have thought of you that way in my own mind for some time now, and the formality between us has begun to feel like a kind of dishonesty. You may, she said softly, her heart beating faster than she wished it to. I told you when we first spoke in the library that I had seen you helping a servant at the summer ball, and that this was what first drew my notice. He paused, staring into the fire for a long moment before continuing. That was true, but it was not the beginning of the story. It was only the moment I finally allowed myself to admit what I had already known for some time. Elinor waited, sensing that something significant was coming, though she could not yet guess its shape. Nearly a year ago, Julian said, my aunt's carriage broke a wheel outside the chapel near the market square, on a bitterly cold evening in winter. I was not there myself, but my driver told me of it afterward, how a young woman had stopped, though she carried nothing but a thin coat of her own, and given my aunt's elderly maid her shawl to keep warm while repairs were made, refusing any thanks and hurrying away before anyone could learn her name. My driver only recognized you later, months afterward, when he saw you accompanying Lady Margaret to church, and mentioned it to me almost as an afterthought. Elinor frowned, trying to recall the moment. She remembered it only vaguely, one small kindness among so many she had never thought worth remembering. I do not understand why that would matter to you. Because it was not the last such story I heard, Julian said. Once I began to notice your name, I began to hear it again and again, in small ways, from people who did not know I was listening with any particular interest. The seamstress on Corn Street told my housekeeper that you had once mended a torn dress for a servant girl who could not afford the fabric, without ever mentioning it to a soul, and refused payment when the girl tried to offer what little she had. The rector's wife mentioned, in passing, that you had sat with a dying woman in the poorhouse for 3 nights running, a woman with no family left to sit beside her, simply because you had heard she was alone and could not bear the thought of it. Alina felt a strange, unsettling heat rising in her chest, something between embarrassment and disbelief. I did not do those things to be spoken of, Your Grace. I did not know anyone was watching, or that anyone would think to repeat such small matters to you. That is precisely my point, Julian said, turning to face her directly now, his expression earnest in a way she had not seen from him before. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who perform generosity when they believe someone of consequence is watching, and abandon it the moment they believe themselves unobserved. I have learned to distrust kindness that arrives with an audience. But you, Alina, have shown the same goodness whether anyone was watching or not, for years, without ever once seeking credit for it. By the time I finally saw you myself, on that terrace at the summer ball, I had already been searching for you, in a manner of speaking, for months, through every small story that reached my ears. Alina sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb what he was telling her. The idea that a man of his standing, a man who could have any woman in the county, had spent months quietly gathering fragments of her life, weighing her worth not by her fortune or her family name, but by acts of kindness she had never expected anyone to notice, felt almost too large to hold. "Why did you not simply approach me sooner if you knew all this?" she asked finally. Julian's jaw tightened slightly. "Because I did not trust myself at first. I told myself it was foolish to build any interest in a woman based on second-hand stories, however moving they were. I told myself that perhaps I was inventing a version of you in my mind that did not match the reality. So I watched more carefully. I attended events I had no interest in attending, simply because I knew your household would be present. I wished to see for myself whether the woman behind those stories was as genuine as I hoped, or whether I had simply grown tired of the falseness around me, and was eager to believe in something better than what truly existed." "And what did you find?" Alina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found," Julian said, "that every story I had heard understated you rather than exaggerated you. I have watched you for the better part of a year, Alina, in ways you never knew, and in all that time I have never once seen you act unkindly, never once seen you seek advantage from another's misfortune, never once seen you behave differently when you believed no one of consequence was watching than when you knew you were observed. I do not know many people, of any station, of whom I could say the same." Alina felt tears gathering, unbidden, and she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let herself be so undone in front of him, though the effort cost her greatly. The weight of being truly seen, after years of believing herself invisible, was almost more than she could bear. Part of her wanted desperately to believe every word he had said. Another part of her, the part shaped by years of disappointment and quiet neglect, warned her that this was too sudden, too extraordinary to trust without reservation. "I do not know what to say to any of this," she admitted honestly. "I have spent so many years believing that my life, my small kindnesses, meant nothing to anyone beyond the moment they happened. It is difficult to suddenly believe otherwise, even when the evidence stands before me." "You do not need to say anything tonight," Julian said gently. "I did not tell you this to demand an answer, only because I could no longer bear the dishonesty of pretending our meetings had been chance occurrences, when in truth I had sought out every one of them. I wished you to know the whole truth, even if it changes nothing between us." Across the room, Lady Margaret shifted in her chair, clearly straining to hear more than the low murmur of their voices, though she said nothing, unwilling to interrupt whatever conversation might be unfolding between her niece and one of the wealthiest men in the county. The carriage ride home that night passed mostly in silence, Alina staring out at the darkened countryside while her aunt watched her with poorly disguised curiosity, clearly desperate to know what had been discussed, but unwilling to ask outright. Alina did not offer any explanation. Her thoughts were too tangled, too overwhelmed, to put into words her aunt would understand, or perhaps even words she fully understood herself. Over the following days, word of the private dinner spread through the county with the particular speed that only scandal and speculation could achieve. Alina found herself the subject of conversations she was never meant to overhear, whispered speculation in shops and church pews about the poor companion who had somehow caught the Duke's eye, theories ranging from cruel to absurd. Some suggested she had schemed her way into his notice through calculated humility. Others suggested the Duke was simply amusing himself before returning, inevitably, to a woman of proper standing. Alina heard both versions repeated, in various forms, by people who had never once bothered to learn her name before. Her aunt, meanwhile, grew increasingly attentive, increasingly eager to secure whatever advantage might come from the connection, and increasingly impatient with Alina's continued hesitation. "You must not squander this," Lady Margaret said one evening, packing the length of the parlor while Alina sat quietly with her needlework. "A man like the Duke does not offer his attention twice if a woman proves too cautious to accept it. Whatever doubts you carry, set them aside. This is an opportunity that will not come again." "I am not doubting him because I wish to be difficult, Aunt," Alina said carefully. "I am doubting because I do not yet understand how to trust something this large, after believing for so long that I did not matter enough to be noticed at all." Lady Margaret waved this away with visible impatience, unable or unwilling to understand the weight behind her niece's words. But that night, alone in her small room at the top of the house, Alina allowed herself, for the first time, to sit with the full truth of what Julian had told her, turning it over slowly in the quiet dark. She thought of every small kindness she had offered over the years, believing each one would vanish unnoticed the moment it was finished. She thought of the loneliness she had carried, quietly, for so long, convinced that her worth existed only in what she could do for others, never in who she simply was. And she thought, finally, of Julian's steady voice asking her, that first day in the library, whether she truly believed she did not matter. She realized, sitting there in the dark, that she was beginning, slowly and cautiously, to believe something different. Not because a Duke had chosen to notice her, though that mattered more than she wished to admit, but because someone had finally shown her, through months of quiet observation, that her goodness had never gone as unnoticed as she believed. The realization frightened her nearly as much as it comforted her, because it meant she now had something precious to lose. The trouble began, as trouble so often did, with a cousin who had never been fond of Alina to begin with. Charlotte Ellery arrived at Lady Margaret's house on a Thursday afternoon, uninvited but never turned away, since she was the daughter of Lady Margaret's late sister, and carried just enough family standing to be tolerated despite her sharp tongue and sharper ambitions. Charlotte had spent the last 2 seasons pursuing a match of her own, without success, and the news that the quiet, overlooked companion had somehow captured the Duke's attention struck her as both an insult and an opportunity. "You must be very pleased with yourself," Charlotte said, settling into the parlor with the ease of someone who considered the house half her own by right of blood. "Though I confess, I cannot imagine what a man like the Duke of Ashworth sees in you. Perhaps he simply enjoys a novelty. Wealthy men do grow bored so easily." Alina kept her eyes on her needlework, refusing to give Charlotte the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "I have not claimed to understand his reasons myself, Charlotte. I would not presume to explain them to you." "How wise," Charlotte said with a thin smile. "Because I do not think they will last. Men like him enjoy the chase, Alina, not the catch. You would do well to remember that before you make a fool of yourself in front of the entire county." Alina said nothing further, though the words settled uncomfortably in her chest, echoing doubts she had already been struggling to silence on her own. She told herself Charlotte spoke out of jealousy, nothing more, and that her opinion carried no real weight. But doubt, once planted, had a way of growing roots even in soil that tried to resist it. The whispers Charlotte had promised did not take long to arrive. At a garden party held the following week by one of Lady Margaret's acquaintances, Alina found herself the subject of open stares and half-hidden laughter as she walked among the guests. She overheard, more than once, comments not meant entirely for her ears but not entirely hidden from them either. They say she has no fortune at all. Imagine a duke courting a companion with nothing to her name. I heard she engineered the whole thing, appearing wherever he might be, playing the humble servant to draw his sympathy. It will not last. His mother will never allow it. Mark my words, by autumn she will be forgotten entirely, and he will marry someone suitable. Alina kept her composure through the afternoon, smiling politely, speaking only when spoken to, retreating to the edges of the gathering the way she had trained herself to do for years. But that evening, alone in her room, the weight of it finally broke through the careful control she had maintained all day, and she wept quietly into her pillow, exhausted by the effort of pretending the words meant nothing when they had struck exactly where she was most vulnerable. It was not only the whispers of strangers that troubled her. A more immediate difficulty arrived in the form of Edmund Farrow, a childhood friend of Julian's family, who had recently returned from abroad and who, upon hearing of the Duke's growing attachment to a woman of no fortune, had taken it upon himself to intervene on behalf of what he considered the family's interests. Edmund arrived at Ashworth Hall uninvited one afternoon, while Alina happened to be present, having come to return a book Julian had lent her. Edmund's manner was polished and pleasant on the surface, but Alina sensed immediately the calculation beneath it. He engaged her in conversation with practiced charm, asking careful questions about her family, her upbringing, her prospects, each answer seeming to confirm something he had already decided in advance. Later, when Alina had stepped briefly from the room, she overheard Edmund speaking to Julian in low, urgent tones through the partly open door. "You cannot be serious about this, Julian. A companion with no fortune, no connections worth mentioning. Your mother's memory alone should prevent you from such a match. Think of what the family name requires of you." "I'm not marrying the family name, Edmund," Julian replied, his voice tight with barely restrained irritation. "I am considering marrying a woman whose character I have come to trust and admire more than any I have known in this county." "Character does not maintain an estate," Edmund pressed. "Character does not secure alliances or satisfy the expectations placed upon a man in your position. I say this as your friend, not your enemy. You are allowing sentiment to cloud judgment that has always served you well before." Alina did not wait to hear more. She slipped quietly back down the corridor, her chest tight with a familiar, painful clarity. She had allowed herself, over these past weeks, to believe that perhaps the old rules did not apply to her, that perhaps kindness and character truly could matter as much as fortune and family name. Edmund's words, spoken with such casual certainty, reminded her sharply of everything she had tried to forget. She left Ashworth Hall that day without waiting for Julian, offering only a brief, polite excuse to the footman about needing to return home before dark. Julian sent a note the following morning, asking if something was wrong, but Alina found herself unable to answer honestly, and so she answered with careful evasions instead, claiming only tiredness, nothing more. The distance between them grew over the following days, not through any single dramatic confrontation, but through a quiet accumulation of small retreats. Alina declined an invitation to walk in the gardens, citing a headache. She kept her replies to his notes brief and formal, the warmth that had grown between them carefully hidden away again, as though she were folding herself back into the small, safe shape she had worn for years before he ever noticed her. Lady Margaret noticed the change and grew increasingly agitated, fearing the loss of an advantage she had already begun to count as secured. "What have you done to discourage him?" she demanded one evening, after another brief, formal note arrived from Ashworth Hall. "You cannot simply retreat now, Eleanor, not after everything." "I have done nothing but protect myself, Aunt," Eleanor said quietly, though even as she spoke the words, she felt their hollowness. "I have heard enough from those around him to know how this will end. It is better to end it now, on my own terms, than to wait for it to end on his family's terms instead." But the truth, which Eleanor barely allowed herself to admit even in the privacy of her own thoughts, was that Edmund's warning had not created her doubt. It had only given voice to a fear that had lived inside her for years, long before Julian had ever entered her life. She had built her entire sense of safety around the belief that she did not matter enough to be truly wanted, that any attention shown to her was temporary, conditional, destined to be withdrawn the moment something more valuable presented itself. It was easier, in some painful way, to retreat now and confirm that old belief than to remain vulnerable to the possibility of losing something she had only just begun to trust. Julian, for his part, grew increasingly troubled by Eleanor's sudden distance, though he did not yet understand its cause. He assumed, at first, that perhaps he had moved too quickly in sharing the full truth of how long he had watched her, that perhaps the weight of that revelation had frightened her more than he intended. He gave her space, believing patience would allow her to return to him in her own time. But as the days stretched into a week, and then longer, his patience began to fray into genuine worry. It was Grace, a young housemaid in Lady Margaret's household who had grown fond of Eleanor over the years, and who had come to know her moods better than most, who finally pieced together the truth. She found Eleanor one evening sitting alone in the small garden behind the house, staring blankly at nothing, and gently pressed her until Eleanor finally admitted what she had overheard at Ashworth Hall. "You are punishing yourself for words spoken by a man who does not know you at all," Grace said firmly, sitting beside her on the cold stone bench. "You are letting a stranger's fear decide your future, when the Duke himself has shown you, again and again, exactly what he believes." "It is not so simple, Grace," Eleanor said, her voice thin. "I have spent my whole life believing certain things about my place in the world. It is difficult to unlearn that in a matter of weeks, no matter how kindly he has treated me." "Difficult is not impossible," Grace replied. "But you will never know what might have been if you continue running from it before it has even had the chance to fail or succeed on its own terms. Give it that chance, at least, before you decide it was never real to begin with." Eleanor sat with those words long after Grace had returned inside, watching the last light fade from the evening sky. She thought of Julian's steady voice, the careful patience with which he had told her the truth of how long he had watched her, the sincerity that had never once wavered even as she pulled away without explanation. She thought of Edmund's warning and Charlotte's cruel words, and the whispered speculation of strangers who knew nothing of her true character. And she thought, finally, of her own long habit of choosing retreat over risk, safety over hope, because hope, once lost, hurt far more than a life spent expecting nothing at all. She did not yet know what she would do, but for the first time in days, she allowed herself to consider that perhaps Grace was right, that perhaps she owed it to herself, and perhaps even to Julian, to face this fear directly rather than let it quietly decide her future in the dark. The following morning, a note arrived from Ashworth Hall, brief and formal like the others she had sent in recent days, but this time carrying a different weight entirely. Julian wrote simply that he would be hosting a gathering at the estate that weekend, and that he hoped, though he would understand entirely if she chose not to attend, that she might find it in herself to be present. He added only one further line beneath his signature, one that Eleanor read again and again, until the ink nearly blurred beneath her tired eyes. "Whatever you believe has changed between us, know that nothing has changed on my part. I am simply waiting for you to believe it." Eleanor stood before the mirror in her small room for a long while on the morning of the gathering, staring at her own reflection as though searching for someone she had lost track of somewhere along the way. She wore the green silk gown her aunt had altered weeks before, the one that had felt borrowed and unfamiliar the first time she wore it. This time, looking at herself, she felt something different settle over her, not quite confidence, but something close to resolve. She had spent 3 sleepless nights turning over every fear Edmund's warning had stirred in her, every whispered cruelty from strangers who knew nothing of her heart, every old wound from years of being overlooked that had made her so quick to believe she was destined to lose whatever good thing came her way. She had also spent those same nights returning, again and again, to Julian's final line, waiting for you to believe it, until the words had worn a groove into her thoughts too deep to ignore any longer. She decided, sometime before dawn on the third night, that she would rather risk the pain of losing something real than spend the rest of her life protecting herself from a happiness she had never allowed herself to fully claim. Grace was right. She owed it to herself to find out. The carriage ride to Ashworth Hall felt longer than any journey she had taken before, though the distance had not changed. Lady Margaret sat across from her, unusually quiet, sensing perhaps that this day carried a weight beyond ordinary social obligation. When they arrived, the estate was already alive with guests, carriages lining the long drive, laughter and music drifting from the open windows of the great hall. Eleanor spotted Charlotte almost immediately, standing near the entrance in a bright yellow gown, clearly positioned to observe every arrival. Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly as Eleanor approached, though her smile remained fixed in place. "I did not expect to see you here," Charlotte said, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "I had heard you were unwell, or perhaps you simply came to your senses at last." "I am quite well, thank you," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "And I have come to no conclusions you would find satisfying, Charlotte." She moved past her cousin before Charlotte could respond further, making her way into the crowded hall, searching among the sea of unfamiliar faces for the one she had come to find. She spotted Edmund first, standing near a group of gentlemen discussing horses with practiced enthusiasm, and she felt a flicker of old anger at the sight of him, though she forced herself to keep walking rather than let it show. She found Julian near the far end of the hall, engaged in polite conversation with an older couple she did not recognize. He glanced up as she approached, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded passed across his face before he composed himself, excusing himself from the conversation to cross the room toward her. "Eleanor," he said, and her name in his voice carried more warmth and relief than she had expected. "I was not certain you would come." "I nearly did not," she admitted honestly. "I have spent the past several days allowing fear to speak louder than anything I actually believe about you or about myself. I am sorry for the distance. It was never truly about anything you said or did." Julian studied her carefully, his expression softening. "Will you tell me what it was about then?" Eleanor hesitated, aware of the guests moving around them, the curious glances already beginning to gather from those who recognized the significance of the Duke stepping away from important company to speak so intently with his aunt's companion. But she found, standing there, that she no longer wished to hide the truth simply because it might be overheard. "I heard Edmund speaking to you the day I left without explanation," she said quietly. "I heard him say that character does not maintain an estate, that sentiment should not cloud your judgment. And I realized, listening to him, that I have spent my entire life believing something very similar about myself, that whatever goodness I might offer the world would never be enough to outweigh what I lack in fortune or family standing. It was easier to retreat and confirm that old belief than to risk discovering it was true." Julian's jaw tightened, a flash of something fierce crossing his features. "Edmund does not speak for me, Eleanor. He never has. I told him then, and I will tell you now, that I have known a great many wealthy, well-connected people in my life, and precious few of them have possessed even a fraction of the character I have watched you display, quietly and without any expectation of reward, for as long as I have known of you." By now, several guests nearby had noticed the intensity of their conversation and had begun, subtly, to draw closer, curiosity overcoming their pretense of disinterest. Julian noticed this too, and rather than lowering his voice or drawing Alina aside for privacy, he seemed, quite deliberately, to raise it instead, loud enough to carry across the growing circle of listeners. "I have spent nearly a year of my life quietly learning who Alina Whitmore truly is," he said, his voice steady and clear, carrying an authority that silenced the nearby chatter almost instantly. "I have heard of her kindness to servants who could offer her nothing in return, her patience with the sick and the lonely, her refusal to seek credit for good she has done when she believed no one was watching. I have watched her, in the months since, choose honesty over flattery in every conversation we have shared, even when honesty was the harder, less comfortable choice. I have found in her a character I have not encountered in any drawing room or grand estate in this county, despite meeting no shortage of women eager to claim such qualities for themselves." The hall had grown noticeably quieter now, guests turning openly to watch, though Julian did not seem to notice or care. Charlotte, standing near the edge of the gathered crowd, had gone visibly pale, her earlier confidence faltering under the weight of his words. Edmund, further back, watched with an expression caught somewhere between discomfort and grudging reconsideration. "I have heard the whispers about this match," Julian continued, turning now to address the wider room rather than Alina alone. "I know what has been said, that she has no fortune worth mentioning, no family connections of consequence, that perhaps I am indulging some passing fancy that will fade with the season. I wish to be entirely clear before all of you that this is not a passing fancy. I have made no decision in this county with more certainty than the decision to seek Alina Whitmore's hand, should she still consent to consider it, despite whatever doubts my own foolish silence may have allowed to take root." Alina stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone in the room must hear it, tears gathering that she no longer had the will to blink away. Julian turned back to her, his expression softening once more from the firm authority he had shown the room to something far more vulnerable, meant only for her. "I do not offer you a title, a leaner, or a fortune, though both come attached to what I ask," he said quietly, though the hall remained silent enough that his words still carried. "I offer you a life in which your character will never again be dismissed as insignificant simply because it arrives without wealth to announce it. I offer you a partner who has watched you closely enough to know precisely what he is asking for, and who wants nothing more than the chance to make certain you never again believe, for even a moment, that you do not matter." Alina felt the weight of every year she had spent making herself small, every quiet act of kindness she had offered without expecting acknowledgement, every whispered cruelty and careless dismissal she had absorbed and carried silently, all of it rising to the surface at once, and finding, at last, an answer she had never dared hope to receive. "I do not know how to simply believe after so long," she said softly, her voice trembling but clear enough for him to hear. "But I am willing to learn if you are patient enough to teach me, and I would be glad, more glad than I know how to say, to spend the rest of my life discovering it beside you." The hall erupted, not with the calculated murmurs of gossip that had followed her for weeks, but with something closer to genuine warmth, scattered applause and soft exclamations of surprise and delight from guests who, whatever their private opinions moments before, could not help but be moved by the sincerity of what they had witnessed. Lady Margaret, standing near the back of the crowd, pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes suspiciously bright, though whether from genuine emotion or triumphant calculation, Alina could not entirely tell, and for once, she found she did not particularly care. In the weeks that followed, the engagement between the Duke of Ashworth and Alina Whitmore became the talk of the county, though the tone of that talk shifted considerably from what it had been before. Those who had once whispered cruel speculation now found themselves recalling, rather suddenly, small kindnesses Alina had shown them over the years, eager now to claim some connection to a woman who had risen so unexpectedly in status. Alina noticed the shift with a wry, quiet amusement, understanding now, in a way she had not fully grasped before, how easily society's opinion could turn on the wind of fortune rather than the substance of character. Charlotte, for her part, offered a stiff, unconvincing apology some weeks later, more concerned with preserving her own standing within the family than with any genuine remorse, though Alina accepted it graciously, unwilling to let old bitterness take root in a life she intended to build with far more warmth than the one she was leaving behind. Edmund, to his credit, sought out Julian privately before the wedding to admit he had misjudged Alina entirely, having finally taken the time to speak with her properly rather than judging her worth from a distance, and the two men's friendship, though strained for a time, eventually mended. Grace, the young housemaid whose quiet wisdom had helped Alina find her way back from fear, was among the first Alina insisted be included in the wedding preparations, a small act of loyalty that spoke volumes about the kind of woman Alina intended to remain, regardless of the title she would soon carry. On the morning of her wedding, standing once again before her mirror, Alina found herself thinking not of the grand estate she was about to call home, nor the title she would soon bear, but of the woman she had been standing in the rain outside her aunt's house, convinced she did not matter enough to be missed. She thought of every quiet kindness she had offered over the years, believing each one would vanish unnoticed, and she understood now, with a clarity that settled deep and warm in her chest, that nothing good offered honestly into the world truly disappears, even when it seems, for a long while, to go entirely unseen. Julian was waiting for her at the end of the aisle, his expression carrying none of the practiced composure he showed the rest of society, only open, unguarded warmth meant entirely for her. As Alina walked toward him, past the gathered guests who had once overlooked her so easily, she carried herself not as the invisible companion she had been for so long, but as herself, fully seen, fully known, and finally, completely certain that she had mattered all along.